You are listening to the OverFunctioning Leadership Podcast, learning leadership concepts through life experience. My friends, welcome to another OverFunctioning Leadership podcast version. I am Alex.
I'm John.
And I'm Zach.
And we are mildly happy that you're with us again today. Mild to excited. So I don't know where that lands us, but
I'm relatively indifferent.
It's warm outside, so I'm ready to go outside.
you like spectrums. You should like my mild to highly excited.
I was indifferent.
What the hell with the indifferent? We're starting out real strong here. We're
Real
indifferent
strong.
about everything. Anyways, we're going to be talking about one-down relationships. Not as in like a one-down stairwise.
Yeah, not a bunch of people on the stairs.
Yeah, more or less on lines of boss to employee or parent to child, pastor to assistant pastor,
Coach to athlete.
coach to assistant coach, some job to assistant job. I think we may have beaten a horse to a pony.
Oh, I see what you did there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't actually see what I saw myself. Anyways, but we need to recap our last one, which was our last OverFunctioning Leadership podcast, that is, which was a question sent into our email, which is theofpodcast@gmail.com, which I believe we said at least 10 times in our last podcast, which was magical. But the overall question came in, and it was talking about how did our individual sense of leadership develop as a teenager or as a young person. And so each of us discussed those things, landing on basically you need to do what if you want to develop your sense.
Yeah, we think we talked about being able to define self, figure out what you believe, what you stand for, communicate that to important others, be open to other perspectives, and it's a long journey.
Yep. Continue listening to this podcast. I also have supplementals if you like to be, you like to have those supplementals to figure out what your guiding principles are. You can email theofpodcast@gmail.com, and I have some items that may be helpful to you.
This does not include Adderall, does it?
No, it does not.
None of us are licensed doctors. We want to get that disclaimer out there. We cannot prescribe you drugs nor provide them.
Yeah, although I do approve of a manic smile constantly. It really brings in people.
As they see the terror in your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yeah. So that's the recap of our last podcast. And we're going to jump right on into the fable. So take off your socks, put them back on, readjust them, and then when they don't feel good, take them off again and readjust. Spend at least 2 to 3 to 5 minutes taking on and putting back off and taking on your socks and to readjusting until they feel just correct. And then you can listen to what John has to say, which is what?
Well, with that introduction, I'm ready to go.
By the way, I'm going to interrupt you. That was my sister's, there must have been, I don't know how many times she did that, but that was her usual
Socks?
go-to. Yes, socks.
Talking about them or actually
Putting them on,
Okay,
them on and realizing they didn't feel good and then take them all the way off for adjustment. It was one of my favorite things.
fond memories.
Yes,
Yes,
fond memories. Anyways,
I can see that.
I digress. Is this about socks?
It could be about socks. I could weave socks into this pretty
Okay,
easily.
well, at some point, Zach has a really good story about socks, but not for this podcast.
Okay.
Email us and we'll provide that story at theofpodcast@gmail.com.
Yes, okay. And now, John.
Time for the fable. Thinking about one-down relationships and what that looks like. So Alex said earlier, gave you a couple examples of one-down relationships. And in families, one-down relationship is child to parent. And in my observation of working with young people and talking with parents, when parents are highly anxious, they tend to do one of two things. This is true of anyone, but they tend to think for others, think for their children, or they tend to leave the children to fend for themselves. So Bowen talked about the two ends of anxiety, fusion and cutoff. So fusion is, I'll tell you how to think. This is how you should think. And cutoff is, I'm not a resource to you at all because I have my own problems to deal with. And with people that are in one-down relationships, this can be really, really challenging. And so the fable I have today is really a quote from Bowen that I think is really helpful as we consider this topic today.
Who's Bowen?
Murray Bowen, I believe.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And why do we care about him so much?
We care about him because he developed Bowen Family Systems Theory, which he named after himself. I don't know that he actually named it Bowen Family Systems Theory or someone did it after he died. I'm not sure which. But it's the theory he came up with about systems in general.
I think they're labeling the specific flavor of family systems theory after Bowen, because I think there's a couple of competing ones, and he has consistently beaten them out and risen to be the superior family systems theory.
So he's the survivor.
Yeah.
Okay.
The top guy.
So here's his quote, and it says, "People who are cut off from their own parental families are the most vigorous in the attempt to create substitute families from social relationships. If social relationships become significant, they tend to become duplicates of the relationships to their parental families. When they encounter stress and anxiety increases, they cut off from those social relationships and seek other, better social relationships." And so when I think about fables, and one of the observations I've had in working with leaders is that individuals with high levels of chronic anxiety. So again, defining chronic anxiety as anxiety that can't be tied to a particular event or something that you can specify. It's something that's just an abiding sense of unease. Those individuals tend to come from families that have a lot of cutoff, a lot of distance between them and family members. And so in a one-down relationship, being able to thinking about how to navigate that relationship, if one could work on closing that gap between you and the other family members, becoming a little bit closer to them if there's cutoff, I think there's real merit in doing that. And Bowen would argue that ultimately would lower the chronic anxiety for all family members.
So we're going to talk about one-down relationships here. And you gave some examples of one-down relationships within a family, specifically when it comes to cutoff. What's the issue with one-down relationships? Like, why is it worthy for us to talk about?
Part of it is because it's so commonplace. We see it everywhere. We see it in our families. We see it in our schools. We see it in the places we work. We grow up with it. And learning how to relate to someone who's not on your same level is almost an intricate function of living.
Boss employee, that's a good example. We all have bosses, whatever industry you might be working in, and how do you navigate that and identify what you believe is true or should happen when you aren't in the authority to make that decision? That can be tricky. It can be tricky for young people who want to do something or not do something, and their parents have a different opinion. And how do I express what I think? I hear this from people. They don't listen to me. They ask my opinion, and I give it, and they don't listen anyways. So it's a frustrating thing for many people.
Mm-hmm. So we need to figure out how do we navigate through that then? So how do you navigate in a one-down relationship where you feel the way in which nobody's listening to you?
Maybe your idea is stupid.
Which is definitely could be true. That could be a true statement right there. Let's say that you have fully thought through your idea and you have self-identification of self-differentiation. Maybe not. I don't know if that's even possible. You looked in the mirror. I'm self-differentiated today.
Bowen says I can only be a 63 on average. That's like super differentiated person. But I look in this mirror right now and I'm 100. Is that what you're saying?
I'm the maximum amount of score I could get is a D-, but dang it, I'm an A+ today. So let's say that you've gone through the rigmarole and you've thought through your deep convictions and you were very resolute on a decision, and your boss says, "Meh, no." What do you do? Because people run into these issues all the time because they feel very strongly about a certain situation, and because of a one-down relationship, they're getting pushed out. What do you do? What are you supposed to do?
Well, we've talked about reactivity before, and I would say first and foremost, you don't want to react. You want to respond. Because I think in that sort of situation, even though you know why you're doing something and you feel like you ought to have been persuasive, you ought to have had some sort of action or result come about from this whole thing, you're going to want to react. You're going to want to subvert that leader, to change that leader, to circumvent their decision somehow.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons this is so difficult, is because of that inherent power differential. If you're a child, you can never be your own parent. So you sort of have to learn how to... Are you thinking of a time travel movie? Is that what you're thinking of, John?
Yeah, I'm thinking of Goonies. I don't know much about movies. That seemed to be an appropriate movie to say at that time.
I'm not sure even where they fit in this. What are you thinking about, like Sloth? Or, I mean, we got the guy in the beginning who's shaking, or what's his name?
Oh, what is his name?
Chunk.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chunk. He's
The Truffle Shuffle?
The Truffle Shuffle. Is that what you're talking about?
Is this Goonies?
John, it would just be great sometime. This is a shameless plug for our Zammers. It would just be fantastic if we just had to come and watch a movie with us and really flesh out the entire thing. It would be magical.
Perhaps the second Tuesday of next week.
Yes, perhaps. Anyways, so we're off the tracks now. I can't quite remember.
We were asking the question you had asked about. Excuse me.
Okay, so I asked about, what are you supposed to do in that situation? So you're in this situation, you feel resolute about your decision, yet your one-down relationship, the person above you has poo-pooed or naysayed what you would like to do. Or there's 1,000 different scenarios we could put here, but...
I think pronouns matter. So I was talking to someone just today who was kind of an assistant to a boss, and they were saying that, I think we're wrong here. That's the words that he used toward a boss. I think we're wrong here. Versus, I've thought through this carefully. This is how I see it, and I'm going to share that with you, and I'm curious how you see it and get your perspective. And ultimately, the boss might say, well, I hear what you're saying, but I've decided we're going to do this. I think it's helpful not to be wedded to an outcome. So when one is resolute that this has to be the outcome, it's just not something you can control. And I don't be too convinced that you're the smartest person in the room. Why can't they see it my way? When one approaches another individual that way, trying to convince them that you're wrong and I'm right, we talked about the scarf model before and what every human being wants. And that status piece, when a one down tells a one up, this is how you should think, that really strikes at the status piece, it strikes at the autonomy piece, it strikes at the fairness piece. And so it's typically a path that's going to lead to frustration.
So as you were talking to me, I was thinking about, let's say that whatever this decision is, that you are in disagreement with your boss. Let's say it's it's connected to your convictions. What do you do? By the way, before you answer the question, the scarf model is Dr. David Rock. In case you want to know where that's at, Dr. David Rock, as in like a stone or rock and roll. Anyways, back to my question, which was, what if the resolute decision that you've come up with is somehow messed up with what your actual convictions are as a person?
The boss could say the same thing. Mm-hmm. These are my convictions.
Okay, so then what do you do?
What are your choices? I guess you get into a bat of wills, This is my idea. Your boss says, well, this is my idea. And I'm in charge and you're not.
Uh-huh. And if it's deeply tied to your convictions, you have to decide whether or not this is something worth dying for, really. I mean, is this worth my job? Is this the hill that I'm going to be dying on? I think that's always it's always a good question to ask yourself. Is this the hill that I'm going to die on?
I think for the people in the double luge, they answer that question a lot, whether or not this is the hill I'm going to die on. I don't know if our listeners have seen the double luge, but it's quite a perilous journey.
It's something that's just stuck with us.
Could you? Well, I guess you could die. Could you die on the hill? Because wouldn't you slide to the bottom of it?
Your corpse would.
Yeah, so I guess you could die on a double luge. Anyways, all right. So, did you have something to add to that? By the way,
I'm just thinking. They talk about how you're tempered in the fire. So in that sort of situation, we talk about your convictions. Where do they come from? How strong are they? What are they? Those are the situations where you really have to figure out if it's something you're willing to stand behind. And assuming that you have two perfectly iron wills that aren't going to crumble, it's almost a matter of consequences, right? It just is. You almost know how it's going to play out simply because neither side's going to back down.
I asked the question, why is it so important for you to be right?
Mm-hmm.
What, is this a pride issue versus, I think one can hide behind convictions and couch it in, I don't know, romantic, that's not the right word, but just principled beliefs. But I would say more times than not, it's a pride issue that is getting in the way. So I think communicating your beliefs and thoughts, if we're not talking about the like something illegal, then I don't know, live to fight another day. And I don't know.
Yeah, but being right provides like different brain chemicals to my head, makes me feel good, which then makes it addictive, and so I just keep doing it over and over again. And I go onto Facebook and I put out my thoughts to where I have to be right, and if you're not in agreement with me, then I'm going to be against you. It's called herding.
It is herding.
I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
And it's a wonderful way to increase influence.
Okay, so...
And that brings up an interesting point. We talk about this idea of herding, and we've also talked about in the past this idea of self-differentiation. And one way to build self-differentiation is through convictions, and you do that by approaching things with a relative open mind. You learn from other people, other experiences. You approach a different variety of backgrounds, and if, let's say, you come into this circumstance where people are against you, you could always thin the herd into more like-minded people like yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And you end up with people who think and act exactly like you and are relatively undifferentiated.
Yeah, how would you increase your differentiation if the only people that you're hanging out with have the exact same differentiation as you? I'm not exactly sure how you do that. Unless you separate yourself from that group and make yourself more differentiated through the strengthening of your own convictions and, the other things that we've talked about, especially when it comes to self-differentiation. So if you do that, if you decide, okay, I'm going to be more self-differentiated and pull myself, I'm not sure you're going to be well fit for that group anymore unless they join you. Mm-hmm. You're swimming across the lake, and if they're not willing to swim the other side with you, then I'm not sure they're going to be with that group anymore. So, okay.
I can think of an example of one down, one up relationships even in the class that I teach. So I was teaching a leadership class with students, and some of the students in my leadership class I also have in an economics course that I teach. And we were talking about one down relationships and how to communicate with, for students in that case. In the midst of our discussion, one of the students said, well, I'm going to say something to you. This was to me. And I hope you're not offended by this. So I was like, ooh, this will be good. And they said that a particular assignment that I give them that they thought was a waste of time. I said, okay. I said, well, so I explained to them the reason that I gave this assignment. And I said to them, if you have a better idea of the way to learn this concept, I'm all ears. I'm open to that. I'm not wedded to this particular way of doing it. Mm-hmm. And the person thought a few minutes. He said, it's just easier to do what you were doing, because he didn't want to think about something different. But I think from a leader's perspective, a one-up of being flexible, of not being threatened by one saying, hey. So I think that can help. What we're talking about here about I have a belief and my boss has a belief and we're entrenched, it sounds so deadly serious. So I think if you can lighten it up a little bit, and I would say the leader of a system, they have the responsibility, I think, to set that lightening tone that this is not, ultra serious here, people. Whatever we're speaking of, let's just come to a resolution, communicate a thought and an idea, and ultimately the leader can say, this is what we're going to do. This is the direction we're going to head. Mm-hmm. And it's up to the others to figure out how they're going to deal with it.
Yeah. It's like driving home that acute anxiety and saying, this is what we're doing. And you've got to figure out what's going to happen on the other end. Yeah, we've talked a lot about we've talked about one-down relationships from the one-down position, but we really haven't discussed as the leader at the top what that's going to look like. So before we get there, though, I had another question about whether when you're in that one-down relationship, so you're the one down, and I feel like we've touched on this a little bit, but let's say you've identified that the person who is above you is not a good leader. What do? You do
their job for them, right?
They love it too. Sure.
Yeah. Uh-huh. So what do you do? I mean, this could be, and I feel like I've interacted with students who would say, especially teenagers, where they would say, no offense to the teenagers listening to this, I'm in a one-down relationship, and I don't agree with what my parents are doing, and like my parents aren't really good leaders, so what do I do there? I don't know.
It's hard for a young person to be the most mature member of the family. So in a one-down relationship, it's difficult when the leader, and I would say from the objective, a student or a young person might say, well, the teacher or the parent is just not very good, and that can be a reactive statement.
Oh, most definitely.
But if it's really thoughtfully done, they might conclude that that's the current condition they're under. That's the reality of their situation. How can one make the best of it? But it can be difficult.
Yeah, well, even when you said that person who's in that one-down relationship, child, let's say, they can't be any more differentiated than their parents, and that's biological. And so, there's studies that have gone over that, and that's why we're saying those things. And so that base level of differentiation can only be as high as your parents are going to be allowing you at that point in time. Now, that does transfer over. There's a difference when you do move out of the home. Something happens there, right? Because you're no longer within that one-down relationship. But I even would say that one-down relationship there's remnants of that even after moving out of your home, right? Would you say, John, that with your father, do you feel like you're somewhat still at a point of a one-down relationship or not? I don't know.
I don't.
Okay.
No, I don't.
And then for me, I there is a little bit of it, I would say, with my parents, but I feel like I've also cleared some sort of threshold. Zach, where are you at?
I would take an opposite position to John. It almost seems as if I've shifted from a mandatory one down, like I am biologically my father's offspring. I am subject to his will as, him being, my dad. But I've shifted to a point now that I'm out of the house to choosing to be in that one down relationship. It definitely has a more friendly vibe in the sense that I am choosing to be a part of his life. I'm choosing to engage in a relationship with him as compared to having to be around him living in his house. But I now choose to be deferential to him in the sense that I want to learn from his experience and the wisdom that I have seen him demonstrate.
hallmark of healthy relationships, separate, equal, and open. So I'm thinking about that equal piece. Where would you say, Zach, in the case where you're speaking of, now that you've moved out of the house, that you're more of an equal to your father?
Yeah, I would. I would say I am an equal in standing in that I now have my own place. I now provide for myself as he provided for himself and my family. And now we're at a point where I choose to be deferential more in an intellectual wisdom type of way.
Do your opinions matter as much as his do?
Yeah, I would say so.
Mm-hmm. I think in one down relationships where things get tough is where the kid or the one down feels like they're not being heard. But what I hear you saying is, even though he's my father, I can communicate my thoughts and ideas, and they are considered to be valid and worth hearing and listening to.
Yeah. And then to jump back to Alex's question, how do you deal with the situation where you don't have that equalness, right? You have the one down where, what was the specific question, Alex?
We were just talking about, like, what if you're subject to a bad leader?
Yep.
Yeah.
And in that situation, I think that it really comes down to expectations, right? You really have to nail down those expectations. That's sort of a practical look at it, but I think a lot of it comes down to knowing what standards you are being held to and then trying to find a solution within those parameters. We talked earlier about these ironclad wills with these equal and opposite convictions, and I think a hallmark of self-differentiation, an individual who's differentiated, is being able to say, this is what we're trying to accomplish, this is what I want, right? And I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but this is what needs accomplished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have an example of being under a leader that I didn't think was especially good. This was a number of years ago, but I had a former principal that's no longer in our area who evaluated me and gave me a low mark on classroom management. And when I asked about this, the person said in order to get the highest mark, he had to observe a misbehavior and then see me correct it. And so since my classroom didn't have any misbehavior, I did not get the highest mark. So I said to this person, so let me get this straight. If I would have planted among a student a paper airplane and asked him to fly it halfway through the class, and if I would have gently went over and discussed this with a student and redirected them, I would have got the highest mark. He said, yes. And I said, that's ridiculous. And I didn't say anything. And he said, well, that's what the rubric says. I said, okay. And so when it came to signing my evaluation, I wrote a little note of protest, if you will, and said it was just, to me, it was just ludicrous. But then after that, I treated the person kindly and nicely and open. I expressed my thoughts and ideas, and I got a lower mark, but I still stay standing today the same as I was if I would have got a higher mark. So I go to the question of which hill do you want to die on? But it doesn't mean you don't speak up.
Yeah, although I would say that there are some people, as you talk through that, I was thinking of, there are people who are put in positions where they're in one down positions, just on a work scale, where it is unfair. Mm-hmm. And these are questions that they're going through, and they're thinking, what am I doing here? And why can't I get anywhere because of my boss? Like, what am I supposed to do? And so that's my question to you guys. What are you supposed to do when you're put in a situation where this is persistent, like I am underneath a bad leader. And that isn't just because I'm being reactionary and I'm like, they didn't allow me to move my chair to wherever. I mean, this is like a legit decision of I'm having issues. And we talked about your options. I think an easy option, as I think through it, I think an easy option is be like, well, you just need to change your job, or you just need to be mad at that person and never, you know what I mean? But like, I don't know if I believe in that. I mean, I guess if you really, really, I mean, it's a really bad situation, I could say, okay, but some people are within their jobs, and them leaving their job now is going to affect retirement. It's going to affect X, Y, and Z to where they can't leave. So, your options are what?
I mean, it's a tough question simply in that we have this expression, it comes down to the lowest common denominator. When you have the lower functioning person in your system leading the system, it's almost doomed to failure. So that's a tough question. You can be more differentiated in your responses. You can be non-reactionary. You can be a functioning person. But if you're doing everything well, I don't know what you can do outside of bearing with the system or leaving with.
I think, is the boss open or closed? To me. And if they're a bad boss, if you will, how can I make them more open to hear my perspective? I think maturing yourself and responding in appropriate ways, even expressing concerns, but also treating them as a human being can make them, I really think it works, make them a little bit more open. And now your influence with them grows just a little bit.
Does that include overfunctioning?
No. I mean,
Okay.
overfunctioning is stuck in a position where this is always. I guess my question is, who overfunctioning about what?
Let's not even go with overfunctioning. Let's just say increasing your own functioning.
I think it's increasing the functioning of the job and responsibilities that you have. Mm-hmm. But I think it's about being curious about others, including the bad boss, if you will, and trying to help that person as it relates to you go from close to a little bit more open.
Aren't you just sucking up?
Some might say that.
I mean,
I'm just playing devil's advocate here, but I could hear people say, well, you're just sucking up to the boss.
And they can say that if they'd like.
No.
Sure.
it's a matter of perspective, and we talk a lot about taking a step back and looking at the system from an outside perspective, right? From a treetop, looking down and seeing the emotional processes that are happening underneath. And one practical way to try and make your boss a little more open might be to make your intentions known. And that might be sucking up, but if you look at a lot of anxiety, it comes from the unknown. And if you're open about what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, it's harder to hold that against you.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right. Well, do you guys have any other thoughts about one-down relationships? I was trying to think of any other questions that I had, but if we were going to have people land on something here, what would we want to make sure they're going to be taken away?
Maybe the same thing we had at the beginning of the recap, which is define yourself, come up with your guiding principles, what you believe, communicate those to important others, and let people come up with their own guiding principles or perhaps reactive ones. And I don't know, try to relate well to all people, sense where there's too much distance between you and another, and work on bridging that distance.
Yeah, inherently, this is a one-down relationship is a relationship.
It is.
And that makes it hard because there's another person involved. So become your own boss, right?
Make it a system of one. Company in your garage.
That's how all good companies start. Apple Computer started with one person, right? No one-down relationships.
His wife was probably still in the kitchen. Or at least in the house. You know, he's still got a wife he's got to deal with, you know. That wasn't a sexist joke. That was, I just imagine, you know, in my house, the kitchen is connected to the garage. So it was a location thing, not necessarily.
Backtracking.
Yeah, there's a hole I'm digging right now. Yeah.
Well, I think that pretty much open and closed. You're hoping that this is going to be a closed book pretty soon, right? You want to close this off, Zach?
Yeah, close this up, find some sort of key, and then don't use it because it's a book.
Unless it's a diary. You've had several of those growing up, right?
I had. That's why the silver bullet took care of the diary.
Oh, boy. Well, you can check us out on iTunes and Google Play and Simplecast and YouTube.
And check us out on YouTube. We have some other ancillary releases that we do. Our Brumbles actually show up on the podcast, but we have Brumbles. We have our main podcast, and then we also have some chat sessions you can check up on the YouTube, as well as what we call Zammers, which are Zach and Alex movie reviews, which we release intermittently.
Yes.
Bringing leadership concepts into movies.
Yep.
So check that out on YouTube.
Exactly what that is. And shout it on out on high on top of your hill as a one down relationship. Actually, John, could you shout from us as a one down to us? We're going to treat it as a one down relationship. Could you shout out Jesse Huffstetler for his what?
His starfish limiter.
Ooh, and because it limits what?
I don't know. It's something technological. I think the reverb or something. I don't know. So it does something important.
Yeah.
There's some looking forward and back in the sound and some ups and some downs, and we just downloaded it.
My brain just melted.
Yeah. So thanks, Jesse.
Thank you for that, and thank you guys for listening. And we will be back in a couple weeks to talk about something different. If you want to, I don't know, decide what we're going to talk about, you could also email us at theofpodcast@gmail.com. So with that, I believe we're good. You feeling good? You ready to
Feeling all
close
right.
this out?
Yeah, let's close it out.
All right. I wasn't sure if you wanted to say anything else that's going to be like questionable and possibly sexist, so you can dig your hole a little bit
I
deeper.
have said enough questionable things. I will say that this whole time, the image of a firefighter climbing down a ladder with a baby in his arms from a smoke-filled building has just been the imagery I've held of this one-down relationship. I think it's because of a ladder or maybe because of red fire trucks, but I'm not quite sure how that relates.
So is the baby the down, or is it going down the ladder the down?
I'm not quite sure. I think it's the ladder, but there's a kid. I don't know.
Is the ladder connected to a truck, or is it just
No, there's a
disconnected? Is it
bright red
extension?
fire truck.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
It's very important for me visually, since I'm seeing you in person. But since this is a podcast,
I have a very muscular friend named John who we play frisbee sometimes, and he's the firefighter I'm imagining, just for reference.
only because it's more ridiculous. Is his shirt on?
Yes,
Okay.
It's a hot building. It's on fire.
It's just okay. It really just helps me visually.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
So for those of you who haven't checked out yet, thanks for listening in. I'm Zach.
I'm John.
And I'm Mr. Muggles. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
See ya.